I don't know about you guys, but when I find a pattern I like, I want to make it over and over again in different ways. It means less cutting. I know it'll fit. I can sew it faster the second or the third time. I can skip the instructions. I know what fabrics will work, and I can usually make it much better. So in today's pattern hack, I'm going to show you how to get more out of a dress pattern you really like by turning it into a top. It doesn't matter if your dress has a waist seam, no waist seam, princess seams, doesn't matter. I'm going to show you how to take any dress pattern and turn it into a little mini wardrobe. So if you watched my recent video about sewing easy vintage details, I turned the Baker dress into a top, and I got a lot of questions about exactly how to do that. I think you guys are a little unsure about this because the Baker has all these vertical seams and panels, and that can seem to make it a little bit trickier to shorten. So I'm going to show you how to create a top from a dress pattern with a pattern that looks like this, a pattern that looks like this, or a pattern that looks like this. Let's start with the steps you'll need for any dress pattern. So no matter what your pattern looks like, you'll need to do these steps first. So the first thing you want to do is determine the length of your top. So to do that, what I like to do is measure from the shoulder joint here, down to about the length that I want. And once I get there, I can add a little bit of length because it's easier to shorten than it is to lengthen after the fact. So I'll just add a little bit, and then once I get my top made, I can shorten it to the length that I actually want. And the reason I like to measure from the shoulder is that that's a point on your pattern that's pretty much fixed. So no matter what the shape of the neckline is, no matter where it hits on the back, if it comes up really high in the back neck, if it's low in the back neck, it doesn't really matter. You can just measure from the shoulder. Another thing you can do is take a top from your closet that you already like, something you made or something you have, and use that to determine the length of your new top. So you can try this on, see if it's the right length, and then just measure from the same point from the shoulder down to the hem, and you'll have the whole length. So the next thing you want to do, no matter what type of pattern you're using, is to mark off the seam allowance wherever you're going to be measuring from. So in our case, it's the shoulder. So we're going to mark off a 5/8 inch seam allowance here along the shoulder. And you'll notice that this particular pattern doesn't have an armhole seam, but we can pretty much tell where the shoulder is. So that's about where the shoulder is right here. And by the way, I'm just using a scaled down version of the pattern just to make it easy for you to see. All right, so you want to do those steps no matter what type of pattern you're using. And now I'm going to show you how to do it specifically on those 3 types of patterns I mentioned. One without a waist seam, one with a waist seam, and a princess seam. All right, let's start with the easiest one, which is one with no waist seam. So for this, I'm using the Seamwork mica dress. So for this, all you need to do is measure the total length that you want from that shoulder seam. And remember, we drew in the seam allowance, so we're measuring from the actual shoulder down to the final length that you wanted. And then we're gonna draw a line perpendicular to the center front. And remember that we added a couple inches when we were measuring just to give us a little more room to play. Next, we're going to cut this pattern along that guideline that we just drew. Now this pattern has a straight across hem. It's pretty much a right angle down here. So there's not much you need to do to adjust it. You can see they match up pretty well. But if your hem was shaped in any way, you could use this as a template. So you just move it up here and redraw your hemline based on the template for the bottom of the hem of the original dress. And I'll show you how to do that on one of the other patterns too. Once you've done that, you're going to repeat the same steps on the back piece so it matches the front. Once you sew up the top, but before you hem it, you're going to want to try it on and just adjust the hem to the length that you want it. So we added a couple inches so that you'd have some room to shorten it and make it exactly the length you want. So do that before you hem. Next up is a dress that does have a waist seam, and I'm using the Seamwork Killian here, which also has a facing and a button placket, so I'll show you how to adjust those as well. First, you're going to mark the seam allowance on that shoulder seam, but you're also going to do it on the waistline. So both on the bodice and on the skirt, we're going to mark the seam allowance on the waist. So now you measure from that shoulder seam down to that waistline seam, and then move it over to the skirt piece, right on that waistline seam, and measure to your final length. So now these 2 lengths, from here to here and from here to here, should add up to your final length. Then draw that perpendicular line again, and then trim your excess and redraw your hem just like we did on the first example. Again, this is a very straight hem, so there's no redrawing to do on this one. All right, so now we still have the button placket and the facing. So the easiest way to shorten those to match your pattern is to take your pattern and line up that waist seam just like this, and make sure that the center front is aligned. And then you can just take your facing piece and lay it over the top. You can see all the notches match, everything should match up, and you can draw in your new hemline on that facing piece. And we'll do the same thing for the button placket piece. And then finally, if you are sewing something that has buttons, you may need to adjust where the buttons sit so that you don't have a button that's too close to the hemline. All right, finally, we're gonna do a dress with princess seams. So I'm using the Seamwork Chantel as an example here. So princess seams can seem a little bit tricky because you have to match the length of the side piece to the center piece. And that seems hard, but it's actually really, really easy. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna mark the final length that we want on the side pattern piece because that's where the shoulder seam is. And remember, we measured from our shoulder seam. So what I'm gonna do is flip this pattern piece over and mark it on the wrong side, and just make a little mark on the wrong side. Now I'm gonna flip this pattern piece back over, and we're gonna draw in seam allowances along the curved seam where these two pieces connect. So we're gonna do that on both pattern pieces. So now we've got our seam allowances drawn in, and what we're gonna do is flip this piece over and we're gonna walk them along that line. All that means is that we're going to align these lines here, and we're gonna slowly rotate the pattern piece like this along the line, just as if we were sewing it. So you're kind of pretending like you're sewing all along this line as you go. And we're gonna keep walking just like that, just rotating along the line like that until we get to that mark that we made. And now we're gonna mark this length on the other pattern piece. So I'm gonna hold this in place. If you need to, you can take a little piece of tape and just kind of tape it down to keep them together. I'm gonna tape it together here at the hem just to keep it in place. Then I'm gonna fold this piece back along that little mark that I made, just like this, and make the same mark on the other one. It's easiest to do this right along the seam allowance here. So I'll mark it right there. And I have the length marked on both pattern pieces. Draw it in here, and we'll cut along that line. Okay, so here's a great example of where you have a curved hem. So this front piece has a pretty straight hem, so there's nothing you really need to do there. But this side piece has a curved hem. And if you want to have the same curve in your top, you can use this as a template. So you just move it up, align that point here, and redraw your curve. And then we'll just trim away that excess to get a nice curved hem. And if you're like me and you want to get the most from your tried and true patterns, then you might enjoy this other video that's all about how to take a top and turn it into a dress. And I make a really cute gingham dress out of Pfeiffer with that.